Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 98. And today we're going to talk about Stevie Wonder's masterwork from 1976, Songs in the Key of Life. And what I have here is the original Canadian pressing, which includes not just the double album, of course, but the 4-song EP. So this is a review I've been waiting for, and I can't wait to dig into it. Please, before I do, just take the time to subscribe if you haven't already. Look at the little banner in the top right. So Stevie Wonder's story is pretty well known. He has patchy success through the 1960s and into the early 1970s. He signs a new Motown contract, and from 1972 on, for the next 5 years, he goes through an incredibly creative period. His new contract with Motown not only gives him better royalties, but it gives him much more artistic flexibility. He's fascinated by synthesizers, particularly after hearing albums by a band called Tonto's Expanding Headband. An American, a guy called Robert Margouleff, and someone I guess best described as a music technologist from the UK, a guy called Malcolm Cecil. And what Margouleff and Cecil had done was built themselves some big Frankenstein massive device which they called the Tonto synthesizer. Stevie is fascinated by this. He's fascinated by the music it makes, and Music of My Mind is the first of 4 consecutive albums on which he uses the Tonto synthesizer. In 1972, he produces Talking Book. This is where his truly classic period begins. Major hits in Superstition and You Are the Sunshine of My Life. He tours with the Stones. He appears on Sesame Street. He becomes a major cultural figure in his own right across the whole American musical scene. That's followed by Innovisions in 1973 and by Fulfilling This' first finale in 1974. And both of those albums win Album of the Year at the Grammys. So he is absolutely at the top at this point. He begins to look at his own circumstances and has not a midlife crisis, but a just about to turn 25 crisis. He starts to openly discuss quitting the music industry altogether, talking about moving to Ghana. He'd done some research and he determined that that was where his own ancestry could be traced. He starts planning a farewell tour, and it looks like it's going to be goodbye Stevie, and he's going to go off to Africa and do good works. This is the message he's sending out in 1974-75. It did persuade Berry Gordy to open his wallet and wave significant sums of cash in front of Stevie. So in 1975, he signs what was then the richest recording contract that anybody had ever signed, with an advance of $13 million and over a 7-year period, other incentives where he could actually make $37 million, which would be the equivalent of nearly $200 million in today's money. He is at this point amongst the very highest paid entertainers in the world. Stevie's new contract gives him enormous creative freedom, essentially unlimited creative freedom, and he sets about making what is going to be effectively his magnum opus. It takes 2 years to produce, most of it recorded in Hollywood at a studio called Crystal Sounds. Stevie self-produces, and there's a total of 130 people, mostly musicians, but also the production team, who end up contributing to the making of the album. He exhibited remarkable perfectionism in the studio, but the amazing thing about this album is, even though that's the case, even though nothing on this album is accidental, it sounds incredibly spontaneous, in some cases almost like a first take. He was still in love with synthesizers, although he wasn't using the Tonto synthesizer anymore. He had a new big machine, not quite as big, called the Yamaha GX1. So early one morning in September 76, the music press are all gathered at this hotel in New York called Essex House, and they're taken by limo via Times Square, where they can see this massive billboard that's been up for months and months and months, hyping the album. They fly out to rural Massachusetts. They get taken to this equestrian farm called Longview Farm, which also had a recording studio, which had recently been added. Eventually, Stevie shows up. He's got a cowboy outfit on. He's got a pistol with a holster, and the holster says #1 with a bullet. He presses play, and everyone is absolutely blown away by this record. It goes right away to #1, where it stays extraordinarily for 13 weeks. There were 4 singles: Sir Duke, As, I Wish, and Another Star. 2 of those went to #1. It's nominated for 7 Grammy Awards. It wins 4 of them, including yet another Album of the Year. So thinking back, he's won Album of the Year then for 3 consecutive albums he's put out, which itself is a shocking and unprecedented and never repeated achievement. It's not really possible to do justice in this format to all of this music. So I'm going to talk about some of the highlights here. I'm not going to talk extensively about the singles, which people know. I'll talk about some of the other tracks in the album, which are remarkable. The first of which is actually the very first track in the album, Love's in Need of Love Today. This begins with Stevie, multi-track, God knows how many times, essentially a chorus in and of himself. Then a timeless Stevie lyric about the need to inject love into essentially the social environment. It's basically a message song. It's so powerful. The singing is so good. Side 2 is incredibly strong. It starts off with I Wish, which I won't dwell on, but you can make a good case that that's actually the best funk tune of all time. Pastime Paradise, brilliant tune, fantastic lyric, haunting use of his synthesizer. But those are quite well known. My two favorite songs on this side are a couple of others. One is Knocks Me Off My Feet, which musically is incredibly complex and astute and cleverly written, full of very jazzy kinds of changes that would be familiar to jazz fans but would not be that familiar to pop fans. And yet at the same time, it's completely accessible. It is really difficult to pull off. Ordinary Pain is the song which concludes the side, and it has a real twist. Through the first, 50% of the song, it is a good Stevie song about how a breakup leaves you with pain, which is at the same time mundane, and yet that pain feels very special to one as a person. But then the twist comes, and it's in the coda. Shirley Brewer then takes the mic, and she gives this impassioned, cynical, bitter, in-your-face response to the part of the story which Stevie had sung. It's not a common experience for me to be listening to a tune and sit up, bolt upright, and be shocked with the direction that the song has taken. This is one of those. You never forget the song once you've heard it. Side 3, I think, is the side that is the only real problem on the album, because it's got 3 songs which exhibit a tendency, which Stevie shows at other points in his career, failure to fade the song out when it's done. All 3 of these songs go on way too long. They outstay their welcome. None of these are bad songs, but there's poor production decisions made, I think, and in some cases there are some gimmicks used which don't really come off. The first of these is Isn't She Lovely? Alan, how could you dislike Isn't She Lovely? I don't. I love it. It's a fantastic pop song. I especially like the 3+ minute edit, which was released a year later after Stevie had spent a year resisting editing it down because he was so pleased and so invested in the longer version of the song. The next song, Joy Inside My Tears, similar issues. A beautiful ballad, needs an edit, just goes on too long. A third of the 3 songs on this side is the one I think, however, that has the biggest issues. And that's Black Man. It's got a great groove through the first 3 or 4 minutes. Problems emerge in the second part, really, where he's assembled a bunch of school teachers and a bunch of school kids. The school teachers shout in kind of an aggressive way these questions at the kids, and the kids shout back the answers. Let's just say Stevie has much more sophisticated and compelling songs about racial inclusiveness and racial harmony than this one. I hate to say it, but side 3 is a little bit skippable on this. Blasphemy, I know. Never mind though, because side 4 is great. 4 excellent songs. Ngiku Lela, which is a song where Stevie sings in Zulu, Spanish, and English. The singing by Stevie is just incredible. If It's Magic, which is a beautiful little song about love. Harp, incidentally, is played by Dorothy Ashby, who was one of the few people on this earth who managed to make a great career out of being a jazz harpist, and I'll review one of her albums shortly. And then we have the 2 songs, As and Another Star, which go on a long time and have these long sing-alongs at the end, which I actually think really work on this album. These are the only 2 that really do. As has Herbie Hancock on piano, but then it has this choral outro with this incredibly catchy melody. Fantastic. And then Another Star brings in a couple of real ringers as guest musicians, George Benson, who unfortunately you can't really hear, I don't think, too well on the cut in the final mix, and Bobby Humphrey. Bobby Humphrey, for me, is the greatest jazz flautist that ever was. And her extended solo in the outro here is just a lovely little slice of mid-70s black music. It's fantastic. Won't talk too much about the 4 songs in the EP, except to say that they're all strong. The highlight for me is Ebony Eyes, which is one of the funkiest tunes you're ever going to hear. There is, in fact, no single bad song out of 21, which itself is amazing. There are some weak moments, as I've discussed, and these, I think, are a byproduct of the fact that Stevie now has total artistic control with all that that entails. It's also historically a very significant record. If you think about that great period from 1968 to 1976, where you had this mixture of funk and soul and politics and culture you can call it black power music, I don't know what you want to call it, but just that great soup of incredible creativity that mixed music and politics and society. This is really the last hurrah for all that. After this, there's disco, there's club music, there's New Jack Swing, and it isn't really until the late 1980s with NWA and Public Enemy and hip hop asserting itself that you begin to see a return of music that had a social message and music which really took the position of the black person in American society as its central piece. It's also for Stevie kind of the end of his great run. There are some glimmers after this. There's some nice little pieces on Secret Life of Plants, and he has some commercial success in the 1980s, which isn't necessarily the same quality artistically as what's on here. But I would say that after this album, you can basically stop collecting Stevie records and you're no worse off. But you have to have this in your collection. 4.5 stars out of 5.